in May 2024, when Joe Biden was still in the White House, when Donald Trump was drowning in criminal charges, when most people in the media were still treating a second Trump presidency like a bad joke that would fade by November. I made 3 predictions in class. Trump would win, America would go to war with Iran, and America would lose that war in a way that would permanently change the global order at the time. Those predictions sounded absurd to most people. Now, 2 of them are already behind us. Trump won. America went to war with Iran, which means the only question left is the one that matters most. How does this end? That is what I want to do today. Not react to a headline, not explain another missile strike, not decode another press conference. I want to tell you how this war ends. And I want to do it the same way I made the earlier predictions, because I never want you to mistake a method for a mood. This is not intuition. It is not vibes. It is not one more loud opinion thrown into a war that already has too many of them. It is a framework, what I call predictive history. You start with structure, then you move to incentives, then you test both against the deep patterns of history. That is all. But if you do it honestly, and if you are willing to follow the logic, even when it takes you somewhere uncomfortable, it becomes very hard not to see where a situation is going. So let us do that carefully. First, structure, then incentives, then the ending. Structure comes first because structure decides what is expensive, what is sustainable, what can be improvised, and what cannot. It tells you what a country can want but not achieve. It tells you what a government can say but not afford. It tells you where power looks much larger in theory than it is in practice. And the first structural reality of this war is brutal in its simplicity. America can dominate the air. It cannot dominate Iran politically from the air. That distinction is everything. The opening phase of this war showed what American military power still does extremely well. It can strike leadership targets. It can hit infrastructure. It can damage factories, air defenses, missile sites, command nodes. It can impose shock. It can impose fear. It can impose cost quickly. But air dominance is not the same thing as political victory. This is one of the oldest illusions of modern empire. It can fly higher, hit harder, and see farther. You begin to think you can solve everything from above. History says otherwise. North Vietnam did not surrender because it was bombed. Germany did not surrender because it was bombed. And every empire that starts believing bombing alone can produce regime change eventually runs into the same wall. A determined state can absorb tremendous punishment if its leadership is organized, if its population believes surrender is existential, and if the geography underneath it punishes ground occupation. Iran satisfies all 3 conditions. That is the first structural fact that matters. America is powerful enough to hurt Iran badly. It is not positioned to turn that hurt into an easy political end state. And once you understand that, the second structural fact becomes unavoidable. If America ever truly wants regime change in Iran, air power is not enough. At some point, it would have to go in, and a ground invasion of Iran is a nightmare, not a difficult campaign, not a risky campaign. A nightmare. Iran is far larger than Iraq. Its population is vastly bigger. Its terrain is harsher. Its mountains complicate logistics. Its state has spent decades preparing for precisely this kind of contingency. It has underground networks, dispersed production, defensive depth, and the kind of strategic memory that comes from watching what happened to Iraq, Libya, Syria, and Afghanistan. Iran does not need to defeat an American ground invasion cleanly. It only needs to make the price politically intolerable. That is what matters. Because America no longer wins long wars simply by entering them. It has to sustain them politically, economically, industrially, and psychologically. And that is where the structure starts turning against Washington, which leads to the third fact. The cost exchange is terrible for America. This war is not only being fought in territory and airspace, it is being fought in production cycles and burn rates. Iran can impose pressure with systems that are cheap, numerous, distributed, and easier to replace. America answers with systems that are exquisite, expensive, centralized, and slower to replenish. That asymmetry compounds over time. If Iran sends something that costs tens of thousands of dollars and America needs a multi-million-dollar interceptor to neutralize it, that is not just a tactical problem, that is a structural timer. The longer the war lasts, the more that timer matters. Because stockpiles are not abstractions, they are finite, production lines are not magic, they take time. Military industrial capacity in a bloated empire is not the same thing as wartime elasticity in a disciplined one. America can spend astonishing sums of money. That does not mean it can replace critical systems quickly enough under sustained pressure. It means it can overpay for them while discovering too late. That money does not compress manufacturing time the way politicians think it does. Iran understands this. Iran is not trying to outspend America. It is trying to outlast the cost logic of American intervention. And that logic is already getting uglier for Washington. Now add the economic structure. This is where the war stops looking regional. The Strait of Hormuz is not just another body of water. It is one of the central valves of the global system. When disruption builds there, energy prices rise everywhere. Insurance costs rise, shipping strains, market confidence weakens, food and fertilizer costs begin moving through the rest of the global chain. Political pain travels outward, then layer the Red Sea on top of that. Now you are not looking at one threatened artery. You are looking at a widening belt of maritime pressure touching oil, trade, transportation, and inflation at the same time. Empires like to talk about limited wars. Supply chains do not believe in limited wars. If energy prices stay high long enough, if transport remains unstable long enough, if household pain becomes visible enough, the war ceases to belong only to generals and diplomats. It enters kitchens, gas stations, supermarkets, pension funds, and election cycles. That is where great powers start losing strategic patience. And that is America's next structural weakness. Its political will is fragile, not because Americans are uniquely weak people. That is too shallow. It is fragile because the American political system is built to absorb spectacle much better than sacrifice. It can sell a sudden strike, it can sell a short war, it can sell moral language, it can sell victory imagery before victory exists. What it cannot sell for very long is a war that becomes expensive, inconclusive, inflationary, and emotionally exhausting. At the same time, Vietnam taught that, Iraq taught that, Afghanistan taught that, and Iran has studied all three. That is why I said in 2024 that this war, if it came, would not be decided primarily by bombs or rhetoric. It would be decided by whether America could convert initial military superiority into a sustainable political project before its own structural weaknesses began working against it. I did not think it could. Then I do not think it can now. Now let us move from structure to incentives, because structure tells you what is hard. Incentives tell you what each player is actually trying to do inside what is hard. What does America say it wants? It says it wants to stop Iran from getting the bomb. It says it wants peace and stability. It says it wants to defend allies, uphold order, and secure the region. That is the public language. But states do not fight costly wars for public language. They fight for systems. And the system underneath this one is oil, financial power, and the broader architecture of American control. For decades, the United States has lived inside an order where control over energy flows was inseparable from control over global finance. The $S role in the oil system did not just make American power larger, it made American deficits, American military reach, and American strategic overextension survivable far longer than they otherwise would have been. Strip away the moral vocabulary, and the underlying American incentive becomes clearer. Control the strategic energy system, preserve the wider financial order that rests on it, prevent any regional challenger from proving that American force no longer guarantees compliance in one of the world's most important energy zones. That is the real American stake. Now, what does Iran want first? Survival. That is not a slogan. It is the whole key. Iran has watched regime change campaigns for decades. It has watched states around it that were weaker, more exposed, or more trusting get broken apart. It knows perfectly well that if it ceases to deter, it does not become safe, it becomes edible. So the first Iranian incentive is survival. But survival alone is too small a word for what Iran wants. Now, Iran also wants recognition as a durable regional power. It wants sanctions broken. It wants its own leverage formalized, not merely exercised in crisis. It wants the Strait of Hormuz to be understood not as a neutral corridor America can discipline at will, but as a space where Iranian power must be reckoned with in every future settlement. And it wants any end state to leave its wider network of regional relationships intact enough that it is not forced back into strategic isolation. That is a coherent incentive structure, not irrationality, not fanaticism. Coherence, and coherence matters in war. What does Israel want? Israel wants much more than security from Iran. Israel wants to prove that when American power becomes less efficient, less patient, and less trusted, it is still the most capable and reliable force in the region for carrying the strategic preferences of the wider Western system. It is auditioning for centrality in a post-unipolar Middle East. That is why Israeli incentives are not always identical to American incentives, even when they align tactically. Israel wants Iran weakened, yes, but it also wants the regional order reorganized in a way that increases its own long-term indispensability. And the Gulf states, they want to survive the transition. That is what weak states near imperial fault lines always want. They are not eager to become martyrs for anybody. As grand theory, they want to stay close to power, but not too exposed to it. They want to avoid being abandoned by America without being trapped under a permanent Iranian shadow. They want optionality until the shape of the winner becomes clear. That is why they will always look more loyal in public than they are in private. They are not ideological players in this war. They are weather-sensitive players. They move when they feel the atmospheric pressure shift. Now, take those incentives and place them back inside the structure we just described. America wants to coerce, Iran wants to survive and emerge more legitimate. Israel wants to inherit more regional weight. The Gulf wants to align late with whoever proves durable. And here's a problem for Washington. The one outcome America most needs is the one its own structure makes hardest to achieve. It needs a clear political victory without a catastrophic ground war. It needs Iran weakened enough to submit, but not a war long enough to exhaust American patience. It needs energy and stability to hurt Iran more than it hurts the wider global system. It needs allies to remain committed while the price of commitment rises. It needs its own public to accept pain without clarity. That is too many needs piled on top of one another, which is why I said in 2024 that even if America got the war it wanted, it would struggle to get the ending it wanted. Now, let me tell you what I think happens next. I do not believe there will be a full-scale American ground invasion of Iran. That is the first prediction. Yes, forces can move. Yes, deployments can expand. Yes, pressure from allies can intensify. Yes, rhetoric can grow more desperate. But a full ground invasion is a different category of decision. It is not an escalation of the current war. It is a redefinition of the war into something far larger, longer, and politically deadlier for Washington. The people around the American presidency may be reckless in speech, but now all of them are stupid in calculation. They know what a ground war with Iran means. It means years, not weeks. It means casualties on a scale the American public has not accepted for generations. It means massive fiscal strain. It means no clean off ramp. It means the risk of military humiliation wrapped inside financial instability. So no, I do not think America invades Iran in the maximal sense required to impose regime change, which means the war remains fundamentally a coercive air and maritime campaign trying to force a political result without owning the ground required to secure that result. And wars built on that contradiction usually end the same way. They drift toward an exit. That is my second prediction. America will begin looking for a face, saving withdrawal within 12 to 24 months. Not because it suddenly becomes moral, not because it admits defeat, not because everybody in Washington wakes up wiser, but because the cost logic keeps tightening. Energy pain accumulates, market pressure accumulates, domestic dissatisfaction accumulates, stockpiles thin, the glamour of the opening phase fades, victory language starts sounding repetitive. The public begins asking the question every empire eventually dreads, what exactly are we still paying for? At that point, the American political system does what it always does when a war becomes structurally inconvenient. It renames retreat, it declares objectives partially achieved, it points to damaged facilities, degraded capabilities, restored deterrence, hard lessons taught. It says peace requires strength and strength has now been demonstrated. It says the mission succeeded because it did not completely fail, and then it starts moving away from the thing it could not solve. That is how empires leave, rarely through confession, usually through narration. Now, here's a third prediction, and this is the one people will hate most because it requires them to think beyond the war itself. When America begins to leave, the Middle East will not become empty. Vacuums are a fantasy, power reorganizes, and the regional order that emerges will be anchored by two powers, not one Iran and Israel. Not because they become friends, not because the conflict disappears, but because both are built to survive the transition better than the others. Iran, if it endures this war without regime collapse, emerges with something extraordinarily valuable proof that even under maximum American pressure, it could not be broken quickly. That changes every future calculation around it. It strengthens its claim to regional legitimacy. It deepens its value to Russia and China. It increases the significance of Hormuz as leverage. It turns survival into status. Israel, meanwhile, continues to consolidate its role as the technologically superior, intelligence-dense Western. Linked power in the Western part of the region, its ties to finance, surveillance, logistics, and corridor politics make it central to the order that replaces straightforward American management. So the post-war Middle East, in broad outline, does not become peaceful. It becomes bifurcated, Iran in the East, tied more deeply into Eurasian systems, Israel in the West, tied more deeply into Western capital and infrastructure systems. And the Gulf states, as always, will adjust to that reality faster than they publicly admit. Now let me answer the three questions people ask most when they hear this. First, will nuclear weapons be used? I am completely unconvinced by the nuclear panic. Nuclear weapons are not just military devices, they are civilizational taboos. The threshold for using them is not low. It is historically extraordinary states talk recklessly about final options because fear is useful, but actually crossing that line would produce consequences so vast, so uncontrollable, and so permanent that almost every rational actor stops before it. Could leaders act irrationally? Of course. But prediction is not about fantasy tales of probability. It is about what structure and incentives make likely, and nuclear use remains deeply unlikely. Second, will Trump negotiate a durable, direct deal with Iran? Number, not in the way people imagine. Iran has no reason to trust an American promise that can be reversed by the next election, the next pressure campaign, or the next presidential ego swing. Washington has already taught Tehran the lesson that signed agreements with America are vulnerable to American domestic politics. Once that trust is broken, it does not come back because a negotiator smiles harder. Any real settlement will require more than bilateral theater. It will require outside structure, outside guarantees, outside weight, which brings me to the third question. How long does all this take? Longer than headlines want. Shorter than empires hope. I cannot give you an exact date because history does not move on a timetable that flatters analysts, but I can give you direction within 12 to 24 months. America begins seriously searching for the exit within 2 to 3 years. The outlines of the new regional order become visible enough that even people who denied the transition will start speaking as if they always saw it coming. And beneath all of this is the largest prediction of all. America is leaving the Middle East, not tomorrow, not in one dramatic scene, but structurally, gradually, unwillingly, and in denial the whole way. Iran is rising relative to where it was. The petrodollar order is weakening relative to what it once was, and the world is becoming more multipolar faster than Washington is emotionally prepared to admit. That was the logic in 2024. It is still the logic now. And that is why I believe the final outcome will not be a clean American victory, not a triumphant regime change, not a stable democratic Iran installed from above, not a restored empire striding confidently back across the region. The outcome will be something much less glorious and much more historical. America will discover that it can still punish, but can no longer easily reorder. Iran will discover that survival under maximum pressure is itself a form of victory. Israel will push to convert transition into permanent centrality. The Gulf will bend toward the new shape, and the rest of the world will study the war, not as proof that American power vanished, but as proof that American power no longer guarantees the endings it once took for granted. That is how this war ends. Not with a cinematic final battle, with strategic exhaustion, with renamed retreat, with regional reorganization, with an empire telling itself it chose to leave the thing it could not decisively control. Back in 2024, that conclusion sounded extreme. Today, it sounds much closer to ordinary logic. And if I am wrong, we will come back and study why, because that is what predictive history is for. Not prophecy, not performance. A disciplined way of asking what structure permits, what incentives demand, and what history teaches empires right before they discover they are no longer as strong as their own story says they are. This war will not end when Washington wins the argument on television. It will end when Washington finally accepts the price of continuing is higher than the price of calling its withdrawal a strategy. And when that day comes, the world will understand that the real turning point was not the first strike. It was the moment America entered a war it could hurt, but not truly shape. Empires do not fall because they stop fighting. They fall because they keep choosing fights their old systems can no longer finish.